What happened in 1979 in Iran?
Well, in 1979, there was a revolution that eventually came to be known as the Islamic Revolution. And even up to this day, many of the observers or those who have strong views that would not like to refer to it as an Islamic Revolution or even a revolution. So because the nature of it in the earlier stages of it started really probably around 1977. It took 2 years. Was much more all-embracing. It was not Islamic in a particular fashion or at all, in a sense. It started with a kind of a very liberal Democrat uh, agenda, which required, which demanded, mostly by people who were the veterans of the older generations of Iranian liberal nationalists that were left out in the Pahlavi period. It's a period of the Shah became increasingly authoritarian, increasingly suppressive, and therefore basically leaving no space or no political space open for any kind of a give and take, any kind of a conversation or participation.
That was in the 70s.
70s, particularly in the 70s.
Can we actually even like just do a whirlwind review from 1906 to 1979?
Yes. Okay, sure. In 1906, there was a period, actually, as you might know, the first decade or so of the 20th century witnessed numerous what referred to as constitutional revolutions, including Russia, 1905, the first revolution, including the Chinese Revolution in Constitutional Revolution in 1910, the Young Turks Revolution in 1908, and the Iranian Revolution in 1906.
Do you understand why the synchronicity of all of it? Why in so many different places, very different
Because
cultures, very different governments?
Very different cultures, but all of them, in a sense, were coming out of regimes that became progressively powerful without having any kind of a legal system that would protect the individual vis-a-vis the state. So the idea of law and the constitution according to which there should be a certain protection, a certain civil society, became very common.
Yeah, but I wonder where that, because that's been that way for a very,
For a
very
way
long time. And so
Yes.
I wonder, it's funny, certain ideas, just their time comes.
Exactly. It's like 1848, when you would see that there's a whole range of revolutions across Europe.
Yeah.
Or you would see, for instance, the Arab Spring. You see all these revolutions in the Arab world, which unfortunately nearly all of them failed. So yes, these are very contagious ideas that moves across frontiers from one culture to another. And I presume we can add to that, there are two elements which one can say was a greater communication, there is a greater sense of a world economy.
Mhm.
And the turn of the century witnessed, the first decade of the century witnessed a period of volatility, particularly in currency. So many of the countries of the world, particularly non-West, suffered and particularly the businesses suffered. And not surprisingly, the business class were in the forefront of many of these constitutional movements, requiring the state to give the kind of a create the right kind of institutions to listen to their voices, to their concerns, and the creation of a democratic system, parliamentarian system in which there would be a representation, popular representation, proper elections, and so forth, and constitutions. And this very much is a kind of a French idea of the constitution going back all the way perhaps to 1789 revolution, Montesquieu, all this kind of philosophes were greatly appreciated, particularly the French system.
So, what were the ideas in the 1906 Iranian constitution?
They precisely the same. They were demanding a creation of a legal system with division of power between the three: executive, legislative, and the judiciary,
Mhm.
not unlike the American system. And they requested basically a certain public space to be created between the two sources of power.
Mhm.
The state, which had this kind of a control over the, if you like, the secular aspect of life in the society, and the religious establishment that had a full control over the religious aspects. And
Mm.
both of them, from the perspective of the constitution, is considered as repressive. And therefore, there has to be a new space opened between these two. And that was the idea of a constitutional revolution. By its very nature, it was an idea of modernity. They wanted a modern society. They wanted a better material life. They wanted a more representation and so forth. The constitutional revolution, as I always would say, is much more of an innocent revolution. It's a revolution that did not particularly have much violence in it,
Mhm.
contrary to many other revolutions. It did not have a centralized leadership per se. That's why actually besides this parenthesis, I'm getting a lot of requests for interviews to compare what's happening now with the revolution of 1906,
Mhm.
1909.
Are there any echoes?
Yes,
comparison?
there are, because that was a movement that started a without a centralized leadership,
Mhm.
but actually various voices that emerged in various among the merchants or the businessmen in the economic community, among the representatives who came to the first parliament, the press, the new generation of the privileged aristocracy who were educated and believed in the constitutional values. All of these voices emerged at the same time, and somehow they managed uh, to coexist in the first and the second parliaments that were created between 1906 and 1910 or 1911.
Mhm.
But they all faced huge problems in the sense that Iran was in a dire economic situation. This is before the days of the discovery of oil, which actually coincides with the discovery. There are two important coincidences. One is that the oil was discovered in the south in 1909 during the course of the Constitutional Revolution.
Mhm.
The second is that in 1907, the two great powers of the time, the Russian Empire and the British Empire, who always honored Iran as being a buffer state between them because they didn't want to get too close to one another, basically came to an agreement facing the fear of the rise of the German Empire.
Mhm.
So this is the period of Entente, as you might know in European history, whereby the French, the British, and the Russians all create an alliance that ultimately leads to the First World War against Germany.
And at the same time, the discovery of oil, that the oil industry being a very powerful defining factor of the 20th century for Iran,
Exactly.
source
But
of a lot of money.
lot of money, but not all of it in the hands of the Iranians. Only 1/5 of it, by way of royalties, came to Iran. Much of it went to the Anglo-Persian oil company, which they actually discovered the oil in the province, Khuzestan province in the southwest of Iran, where is the major oil industry is today, right now. And this was an extremely profitable enterprise for that company and for the British government. It's actually purchased by the British government. Churchill purchased Anglo-Iranian oil company for the British government. So it was not anymore a private company. It was a British interest, as a matter of fact. And in the course of the 20th century, although it helped the modernization in Iran, but it also helped the creation of a more authoritarian, more strong state, if you like to call it. That 19th century Iran never had that kind of a power, never had that kind of resources. In the 20th century, even that 1/5 of the income that reached the Iranian state gave it a greater power.
That's another coincidence. So yes, you could say the oil was one of the catalysts for absolute power, but the 20th century saw quite a few countries have dictators with power unlike anything else in human history.
Yes.
That's weird too.
Precisely. And you can name them from the beginning of the century with people like, I don't know, Lenin or Stalin, of course, Hitler, even Mao, of course. Okay. You can name them, and probably, as I would say, is the last of them is Khomeini in that century, that you would see this strong man with a sense of either artificial or real, or a sense of a so-called charisma, and with this total power over the regime that they create. Some of them do. Nasser, he didn't have much of an oil resources in Egypt, but he was also one of these strong men, okay, in the 20th century, loved by some, hated by others. So it necessarily does not tie up to economic resources underground. But in the Iranian case, unfortunately, it did. And it created more than one issue for Iran. It's created a strong state, which is the Pahlavi state from 1921 onward. Because in 1921, at the end of the First World War, Iran was in almost a state of total bankruptcy. And the British had a desire to try to bring Iran to the system that they created in the Middle East in the post-war era, the mandate system, Palestine, Iraq, and then, of course, French mandate of Lebanon and Syria, all of this. And Iran was separate because Iran was an independent country. It wasn't part of the Ottoman Empire that collapsed. So they had to somehow handle it. And what they tried to do didn't work. As a result, partly domestic, partly international issues brought about a regime which is headed by the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, Reza Shah. Okay, first a military officer called Reza Khan, actually a military officer of the Cossack forces. And the Cossack forces was the force that was created in the 19th century model of the Russian Cossacks. When the ruler in the 19th century visited Russia as in a royal tour, and the Tsar showed the great Cossack forces, he said, I like this. And he created one for himself with Russian officers, actually. So the Russian officers served in Iran from around 1880s up to the revolution of 1917, the collapse of the Tsarist regime.
So many revolutions.
So many revolutions. And Reza Shah was an officer in that, Reza Khan was an officer in that force. And he created a new monarchy for reasons that we need not to go to it. And it's called the Pahlavi regime. Pahlavi regime was a modernizing regime, okay, that brought in effect, fulfilled many of the ambitions of the constitution, many of the aspirations of the constitutional revolution. Better communication, secular education, centralized state, centralized army, better contact with the outside world, greater urbanization. That's what a modern state is all about. And in that regard, in a sense, for the first 20 years up to the Second World War, was successful. Despite, and more significant of all, it managed to keep the European powers, which was always interfering in the local affairs of Iran, in an arm's length. So they were there in an arm length, but they were also respecting the power of the state, power of the Pahlavi state. During the Second World War, the same phenomenon as earlier interference led to the occupation of Iran by the Allied forces, the British from the south, the Russians from the north, the Red Army. They took over Iran, and of course they said
during World War.
Yes, from 1941 up to 1945, and of course when the Red Army refused to withdraw from Iranian Azerbaijan, and with some thought of possible annexation of that province, there was a big issue in the post-war Iran.
So after 1945.
Yes, 1945 to 1946, there was a big
Soviet Union getting greedy.
Yes, but eventually they agreed. Eventually Stalin agreed to leave the Azerbaijan province in the hope that it would get some concessions from Iran, which in the oil of the Caspian area, which didn't work, and it's a different story altogether. But what happened is that in the post-war era, between 1944, 45, and 1953 is a period of greater democratization, because that Reza Shah's dictatorship basically disappeared. And this is where you would see political parties, free press, a lot of chaotic, really, as democracies often are.
So something like, was it officially a democracy?
Yes, it was a democracy.
Was there elections?
There were elections, yes, of course. Yes, of course. And there were very diverse political tendencies came to the picture, including the Tudeh Party of Iran, which is Communist Party of Iran. This Communist Party of Iran is probably the biggest communist party of the whole of the Middle East, and one of the biggest in the world, actually, at that time.
Did the Soviet Union have a significant influence on the...
Of course. They were basically following orders from the Soviets, although they deny it, but in reality, that's the case.
Yeah.
But what happened, they were seen by the Americans during the Cold War as a threat. And Iran was going through a period of demanding nationalization of its oil resources. That's a very important episode with Mossadegh, whom you might have heard about his name. Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh was the prime minister and the national charismatic leader from 1951 to 1953. Prior to that, he was a famous parliamentarian. But this period, he was the prime minister of Iran. And he nationalized the Iranian oil industry, and the British didn't like it at all. And eventually resulted in a famous coup, which at least partly was supported by the funding and by the moral support of the British and the Americans, particularly by the Americans. It was always seen as one of the earliest and the most successful CIA operations during the Cold War.
So CIA had something to do with it?
Yes, of course. That's one of the earliest operations of the CIA.
Wait a minute. What was... Yes, of course. What was the CIA? What was the CIA doing?
CIA, this is the time at the post-war era.
In the 50s.
In the 50s, 40s and the 50s. Mm-hmm. The British Empire, which was really the major superpower of the region after the collapse of the Tsarist Empire, gradually took the second seat to the Americans, who were the newcomers and the great powers and the victors of the Second World War. And the Americans viewed Iran as an important country, since it has the largest common borders with the Soviet Union, and it was did the south was the Persian Gulf, which at the time was the greatest supplier of oil to the outside world. And therefore, the Americans had a particular interest in Iran. And in the earlier stages, their interest was in the interest of the Iranian government, because they wanted to get rid of both the Soviet Union, which made a return in the post-war era, and of course the British that were gradually withdrawing from Iran. But they had a full control over the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. They changed the name to Anglo-Iranian Oil Company when the name of the country officially changed from Persia to Iran in the West. The name of the company changed. And they got into a huge dispute with the Mossadegh government that eventually led to the coup of 1953, which eventually created a very, very distressful memory in the minds of many of the Iranian nationalists, that this was the betrayal of the great powers, the British and Americans. Yes, CIA played a part, because CIA feared, contrary to the British that they were afraid of their own oil in Iran, the CIA was afraid of the Soviet penetration in the South, and particularly because there was a very powerful very powerful communist party in Iran, the Tudeh party of Iran. So they gradually shifted between the Truman administration and our Eisenhower administration. These are early days of the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
And then they actually did participate to send their agents. There's a long story to that. And it eventually resulted in a successful coup that removed Mossadegh from power.
What's the United States interest here? Why are they using CIA? Are they trying to make sure there's not too much centralization of power in this region?
They were afraid of the fact that of the Soviet Union, and during the Cold War, that was their concern. The only concern.
They actually almost want to protect Iran and its own sovereign processes from influence of the Soviets.
Yes, because they were afraid of the fact, if Iran, or at least this is part of the, I'm simplifying a very complex picture, but the Americans basically were thinking that if Iran is going to be lost to Soviet influence, then eventually basically all the oil resources in the Persian Gulf are going to be threatened.
Yeah.
And this would basically is the national security of the United States and all of the Western allies, European allies. So in a sense, this was the long arm of the CIA to try to make sure that that's not going to happen. And then, of course, they were persuaded by the British, because British were the old hand, which were in Iran since the beginning of the 19th century. They always had relations with Iran and so forth. So they gradually replaced. Of course, I don't want to give them this kind of a satanic view that Americans was a bad influence, because they had also some very good influences in Iran. But this particular episode somehow shed a dark light on the American presence and was used and abused time and again, particularly the Revolution 1979, which was this great Satan idea that Khomeini created. Basically was based on the fact is 1953, you were responsible for the downfall of a national government in Iran, which as a matter of fact, he had no respect for it. Khomeini had no respect for the secular national liberals, including Mohammad Mossadegh. But he was using it as a rhetorical tool for his own purposes. But what happened is that after 1953, we see again the rise of authoritarian Mohammad Reza Shah's power.
And that's the Shah?
That's the Shah that we know as Shah. This is the son of Reza Shah.
And technically, what is Shah? Is it?
Well, Shah is an old term in Persian that comes from a pre-Islamic Persian of ancient times.
So in the context of democracy, should it be seen as like a supreme leader, king?
Is the head of the executive power. according to the Constitution of 1906.
Oh, that's in the Constitution, the actual
Of
term
course,
Shah.
he has a place in the Constitution.
But the actual term Shah, okay, interesting.
But the Shah is a very old term, as I
Yeah, it's almost like a monarchic term, like
It is.
like a king.
Yeah, it is actually is a term peculiar to Iran. I've written about it somewhere. But because the term that the Western world in the ancient times has been Rex for royalty and the king. In the Eastern world in India is Raj, is the same origin, the same root. Iran never shared that. They had the idea of, because Rex and Raj, I don't want to get into too much of a etymology, but this is an interesting one.
Yeah.
Rex and Raj both means the one that opens the road for basically enforcer of religion. Okay, enforcer of the right religion, because Rex and Raj both have the etymological origin of right. You see, and right means the right religion, basically.
By the way, there's so much beautiful language here. I'm just looking at the Persian Constitution of 1906, and it says it's the Constitution of the Sublime State of Persia, Qajar, Iran. I mean, just the extra adjectives on top of this stuff is beautiful. I mean,
because that was actually the change that came about. I don't want to go too much into it, but it was called, as I pointed out before, the guarded domains of Iran.
Yes.
They changed that to the sublime state of Iran during the Constitutional Revolution, because they wanted to give a greater sense of centrality of the state.
Yeah.
And sublime was the term was used.
But also, what permeates all of this is a poetic. I mean, there is a history of poetry,
of course, very strong
to the culture,
which
is fascinating. So, I mean, it's I of course I don't speak the language, but even in Russian, there's also a music to the soul of the people that presents itself in the form of poetry and literature in the way that it doesn't in the English speaking world. I don't know what that is. There's
yes, there's a romantic side.
Romantic
side, almost. Yes.
Romantic side. That's right.
Yeah, I agree with you. In Iran, of course, there's a time of the Constitutional Revolution is a time of great poetry. This kind of a patriotic sentiments that comes through poetry plays a very important part. Yeah. Of course, these days poetry has kind of declined. And instead, you see the visual image that it's at the center. That's why cinema is so important.
Kids these days with their TikTok.
Yeah, let me finish this about the period of Muhammad Reza Shah. He built up, because he received a greater income from the oil revenue, and he built up a very strong state with a strong security force, a strong security apparatus, which is the SAVAK, which is an acronym for the security force in security organization. And he, of course, unfortunately, in the 1960s and 70s, particularly 1970s, basically suppressed the voices of, or possibility of any kind of a mass participation in the political process. It became very much an authoritarian regime with its own technocrats, very much a modernist vision of Iran's future, and almost kind of messianic, that he was hoping that Iran in a decade would become the fifth most powerful state in the world and reaches, as he would have said, the gates of the great civilization. Very much in the mind had this image of ancient Iran, of the Achaemenid Empire. And we want to go back to that greatness of the Achaemenid Empire. Somewhat rather naive and very nationalistic in a crude fashion. And what happened is that as a result, there was built up some kind of a resistance from the intellectuals, from the left, eventually resulting in a kind of a protest movement, as I said, by 1977, 1978. Then, of course, the question that comes to mind, and that probably you would like to know about, is the fact that why it becomes religious, why it becomes Islamic, if it's the popular, nationalist liberal tendency of opening up the political space and allowing greater participation, going back to the constitution of 1906, 1907, why it's all of a sudden it becomes Khomeini? Where does he come from?
Mhm.
The reason for that, at least in a concise fashion, is the fact that on one area that after the greater suppression of all the other voices remained open was religion. Mosques, the mullahs on the pulpit, and the message that gradually shifted from the old traditional message of the Sharia of Islam, I mean, all the rules and regulations of how one has to live, into something very political. And not only political, but also radical political.
Mhm.
So, in the whole period from the Constitutional Revolution to the Revolution of 1979, basically the religious establishment gradually was pushed to the opposition. They were not originally, they were very conservative, supporters of state, as the Catholic Church, for instance, was supporter of majority of the authoritarian governments around the world. But the politicization was the result of isolation because they were left out of the system. And while in isolation, they were not successful in trying to reform themselves, to try to find answers to many of the questions of modern times. What happens to women? What happens to civil rights? What happens to a civil society?
Mhm.
How the modern law and individual freedoms have to be defined in Islamic terms,
How to separate religion and state.
or how to separate the religion and state. These issues were never addressed. What happened is that there was this bypass through political Islam and revolutionary Islam, as it gradually they learned, that this is the bypass to power, basically, to become again a voice in the society and eventually a prominent voice and eventually a monolithic voice in the society. That's the process that led into the revolution of 1979. Basically, this period, greater attention was paid to religion, even among the secular middle classes, who were alienated for a very long time because of this extensive modernization of the Pahlavi period. They didn't have a sense of that old mullahs with their turbans, but they had a kind of an aura in this period. Yes, they are those who remained not corrupted.
Mhm.
They are the people who basically went against the suppression of the Pahlavi regime. And Khomeini became a leader, a symbol of that. Nobody ever thought in the earlier stages, among these very excited multitudes that came to the streets of the Iranian cities in 1979 or 1978, actually, thought that this old mullah in its 70s that all of a sudden has appeared from the Najaf through Paris to Tehran is going to take over and create a autocracy, a religious autocracy.